Shalom, almost Chag Sameach. Welcome to the joint Tikkun Leil Shavuot for Shomer Torah Synagogue and Temple Aliyah. We're going to get started. Our opening session is called Our Side of the Covenant. It's about homelessness, Tikkun Olam, and embodying our covenant with God. Our first presenter's name is Annie Fox. Annie Fox is a regional lead organizer at LA Voice, a PICO affiliate in Los Angeles County, and representing over 56 congregations. Formerly, Annie was the lead organizer at the Sacramento area congregations. Annie is originally from New York City, right? Yankees? No? Okay. She began, what? All right. She began her career as a union organizer in Boston, Massachusetts. The child of a Baptist mother and a Jewish father, Annie quickly felt called to interfaith organizing and completed the Jewish Organizing Fellowship in 2008. She worked as an organizer with member institutions of the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, an industrials area affiliate from 2009 to 2012, and began working for PICO in 2012. It's my pleasure to call up Annie Fox for our first presentation.
Good evening, and good Shabbos, I think, for another 5 minutes or so. So, again, I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about what is this covenant that was revealed to us, and what does it mean for us as a people to uphold the covenant of remembering the Lord our God, who brought us out of slavery, who brought us out of Egypt, and to put no God before God. But before that, a little bit about me, a little bit about my organization. LA Voice, as the rabbi said, is a network of about 56 congregations here in Los Angeles County of a multitude of faith, ethnic, geographic, class representation. We organize all the way out in Calabasas with Orami, all the way down in South Los Angeles into Inglewood and Long Beach with a number of Catholic, Presbyterian, Episcopal churches, synagogues, and mosques, and all the way out into Baldwin Park and Pomona. I'll be actually out in Baldwin Park collecting signatures tomorrow at a Catholic church. And we believe that when congregations from a multitude of traditions come together, we are more powerful in our ability to do the work of serving God, of walking and working for justice. I was called to this work, as the rabbi said, partially because I'm the daughter of a Jewish father and a Christian mother. I was raised actually attending B'nai Jeshurun, which many people may know is a pretty popular synagogue in New York City, which actually, since a fire that happened when I was 8 years old, has been sharing space with the Methodist Church, in which I was also raised learning and attending services. But particularly, I was not just born the daughter of a Jewish father and a Christian mother who decided to teach us both faith traditions, but I was also born the daughter of one of 20 women to graduate Columbia Law School, a pioneering feminist woman who, at a time when her parents told her that her role was to serve the family, got 1,600 on her SATs, went off to Cornell, came to New York, and became a lawyer. And not just became a lawyer, but became a litigator, which at the time they told her was the contact sport of the law and not something that was appropriate for women. I love the weekends that the movie Notorious RBG is coming out, and thinking about that tradition that my mother lived in. My mother worked as a federal prosecutor for about 15 years, serving the national government, and eventually joined my father's law firm. Had me when I was about 8 years old and my mother was 48. Things became very difficult in my parents' law firm. Things became very difficult in their marriage. And my parents got divorced. My mother ended up having to leave the law firm. And as many of you may know, at that point, as a 48-year-old lawyer with no clients of her own, my mother had a very hard time finding work as a lawyer again. And she actually spent several years out of work, partially because it was hard to find work without a client list, and then eventually because she fell into a very deep depression that was very hard to come out of. And I remember at that time my mother saying to me, my mother who had worked so hard to defy expectations by chasing this career and winning some success for herself, I remember her saying to me, Annie, I don't know who I am if I don't have a suit to put on in the morning. And so I was in this very interesting position. I had been at a private school for most of my life. We had left when my family had this sort of economic crisis. And eventually, because the headmaster knew my family and was very concerned for my family, we were allowed to go back on a scholarship. And so I looked like every other Upper West Side white, well-to-do girl in the school. But actually, I had something very different going on at home. And this very weird moment of knowing that I was on a trajectory to do what my parents did, to become a lawyer or a doctor and have some success and status in my life. But I think, frankly, this very deep fear and almost anger of how much I was realizing that status had impacted my mother's own sense of her self-worth, and an unwillingness to let that status define my own sense of self-worth. So perhaps it's not surprising with this kind of pain that was happening in my life, I ended up becoming a union organizer and organizing for those who were in uniforms to claim their dignity from those who were in suits. But at the same time, I realized that my parents were the people who were in suits. And this tradition of fighting one class against another was not actually the world that I believed in living in, and that what I wanted was dignity and a sense of justice and self-worth for all people. What I wanted was a world where status wasn't what defined us. And when I look at our tradition for the way that status and this craving for status plays out, I think a lot about the Tower of Babel, which is a time when people came together and were able to be powerful together and use their similarities to build this beautiful tower that could give them the status to reach God and to rival God. And what does God do? God comes in and interrupts us and says, this is not what I want for my people, to build the kind of power that is going to rival me. And so he gives us many tongues and makes it harder for people to understand each other, to teach us some humility, right? And that we are not about trying to rival the status of God. But what's interesting about this story is I think often when we talk about it, what we're taught is not just that God wants people to be humble, but that God doesn't want us to be powerful. That God makes people different in order to keep us from being able to work together and be able to be powerful together. Which is interesting when you think about tonight, when we spend a lot of time in Exodus with God teaching the people of Israel to be powerful, and that we are a chosen, powerful people, that working together cannot just escape slavery, but can be built to be one of the most important nations, and a nation worthy of Torah. This theme of towers brings me to the topic that I was asked to speak about tonight, which is homelessness. And in Los Angeles, I think we can all agree, we are a city that is full of big, beautiful towers, and yet not actually the ability to house our own people. Many of you probably know the statistic that there are over 50,000 homeless people in the county of Los Angeles. A much less known statistic about that, and a county that I think people often believe is full of homeless folks who came from all across the country, came to become movie stars, got addicted to drugs, and fell into homelessness at Skid Row. Actually, 70% of folks who are homeless in Los Angeles County live in the community where they were last housed. Our homelessness crisis is not about people across the country fleeing to Los Angeles and living a life of homelessness here. Our crisis around homelessness in Los Angeles County is about people who were once housed here no longer being able to live here, no longer being able to afford rent. In a similar statistic, many of us, when we think about homelessness in this county, think of the tent cities we see on the street. think of drug addicts, think of people experiencing trauma who can't work. That is a significant portion of the homeless population in Los Angeles County, and that's a significant part of the problem. The tent cities that we see all over the place are heartbreaking, concerning, and also a threat to public health. But actually, those communities are only about a third of the homeless population. The vast majority of homeless folks in this county are folks who are living in their cars, living in garages, living in other extremely unsafe conditions, simply because they cannot afford a home. So what is it we're called to do about it? And what does it mean to be a people that is powerful but also humble? I'm somebody who I love thinking about women in the Bible. I love thinking about Exodus. And so I think actually the story of Exodus and the story particularly of Moses' birth teaches us two very interesting things about what it means to be powerful. The story of Exodus starts, as people know, with the baby Moses being found in the river by Pharaoh's daughter. And she's referred to just as Pharaoh's daughter without any kind of name. And what I think is so fascinating about the role that Pharaoh's daughter plays in rescuing our most important prophet is that she finds this baby and has the compassion and love for this child that she's willing to rescue him and take him on as her son. But what's amazing to me about it is that when she finds this baby, the first thing she says is that this must be an Israelite child. And what that tells us is that she knew why this child was in the river. She knew that this baby infant was in the river because he was being under persecution of being killed. And she knew that the reason, the system, the structure that was causing that child to harm and threat for his life was actually being executed by her own father. And when we think about that, this woman who had the love and compassion to take this child in as her own son, but wasn't able to actually confront or challenge the structure of evil that her father was implementing, that this child should be in this position, I think that says a lot about our own role and the own ability we have to think bigger about what are the structures that are causing persecution for our children. What are the structures that are putting this child in the river? And what are the places that we could be calling them out that we're not? Interestingly, in the very same chapter in Exodus, we see actually two women who we may not think of as being very powerful, but happen to be in a place where they have some power to execute, the two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Shiphrah and Puah, who are named in the Bible, do almost the opposite. They, using the fact that they are the midwives who are able to execute this system, lie to Pharaoh and say, the Hebrew women give birth too quickly. We cannot get there in time to keep these children from being born. And so we're able to use their position within the structure to interrupt it. Which is interesting when we think about then God raising us up as a people to interrupt the entire structure of Egypt. And what were the two different ways that these women used their position in society to choose to interrupt structures or not, when they clearly had the same compassion for the children being impacted. So here we have a structure being built up to God, to rival God, versus people using their power to interrupt structures of evil. And here we have a county of Los Angeles with a huge homelessness crisis that we all know we need to tackle. And how do we think about the individualized pain that we're seeing people experience? And how do we interrupt the structures that are causing that pain to happen? So I want to invite up Alex Dobbs. Alex spent the last year working with an organization called Kingdom Causes. Kingdom Causes is a faith-based organization in the San Gabriel Valley that works with the Alhambra school system to support families experiencing homelessness, to consult them and guide them through the process of finding housing. And Alex is going to speak a little bit about his experience serving families, the structures he saw getting in their way, and the work they did to do something about it.
Thank you, Annie. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Dobbs, and Annie invited me here to kind of share some stories about families that I worked with who are experiencing homelessness as I worked as a case manager. But I'm going to begin, I'll get to that, but I'll begin by sharing a little bit about my story. So I actually grew up in a Christian family in Pasadena, California, and I attended private Christian schools. In high school, I started taking my faith really seriously and reading the Bible on my own, and realized just how much God cares about justice, and started wrestling with this question of what does it mean for me to live justly in the world now that I'm exposed to a lot of injustices that I learned about in one of my classes. And my journey led me to study a social justice type major at Azusa Pacific University. And going into that, I realized later, my pursuit for justice was really focused on myself, and was really kind of self-focused and selfish, asking the question of how do I be faithful to God in seeking justice. And as I've grown in maturity over the years, I've come to kind of take the focus off of myself and learn to really focus on seeking the shalom of the world and God's justice and the well-being of others. Not just my involvement in that. And through that process, I also learned to kind of think more structurally and systemically and collectively about the issues that lead to poverty and injustice and the root causes of that. Just like Annie was saying, that we need to confront structures of injustice like Pharaoh in Egypt if we're going to see systemic liberation. There's this parable that is common when talking about justice and helping people who are poor. And it goes, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. The third part of that parable that often doesn't get told really asks this question: does the man have access to the pond? We're looking at, is there opportunities that this person have? They may have all these skills, but is someone willing to offer them a job? Or is there an opportunity to use that skills to provide income for themselves? When I working with homelessness, I've realized we need things firing on all cylinders, on all three levels. We need food banks that are feeding people who are hungry. We need shelters that are providing safety where homeless individuals can recover and teaching them skills so that they can fish. But we also need to change the whole housing landscape so that there's room in the pond for people to move into their own housing, and that the pond is big enough for everyone involved. So working as a case manager, I worked with families who are identified as homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act, which is a national law that mandates all school districts to provide supplies and resources for families who don't have fixed, regular, or adequate housing. And so that looks like giving them free lunch and free or reduced lunch, free school supplies and uniforms, helping with bus tokens so that they can get to school, or those are some examples. And the school district I worked with in Alhambra, our nonprofit partnered with, is really unique in how they really took this mandate seriously, and they provided services like our nonprofit organization to provide additional support to these families. And so my job was to basically interview families and connect them to resources that would help meet their needs so that they can become self-sufficient. And during my job, I would go to these meetings with all these other service providers helping families who are homeless, and we'd meet, got into conversation with the director of Union Station, which was it's the big agency in our area that has all the money and resources and a lot of the responsibility for providing services to families and individuals who are homeless. And she would tell us, in this meeting we just had, the person from the county is wanting us to, is upset that there's families that are sleeping on the street, and, says if you need more money, ask us and we'll give you more money. But the budget we already have to put families in shelters, we're not even spending, because we only have relationships with 2 hotel owners that are willing to take our clients, 2 motels, and we only have X amount of beds in our shelters, and it's taking on average 6 to 8 months for families, once they get into our shelter, to find housing that is affordable. So that there's a system where it takes 6 to 8 weeks just to even get an interview with people from this organization, so that they can interview you, intake you, and then connect you with what's called a housing navigator that kind of helps you navigate housing and find somewhere that is open and affordable. And also, for families, there's only about 7 shelters in LA County that will provide shelter for families, which leads to about a little over 100 persons. So the amount of services that are there to match the need is just very, very minimal, which creates a lot of backlog in the system. And really, I through this process just realized, like, there's just this issue for not enough housing in general for people, and just not enough affordable housing. So even the services that are in place to help these people aren't working, because on a systemic level, there's just not enough housing. In our school district, we identified over 200 students that are identified as not having fixed, regular, adequate housing. And then there's another school district in Hacienda Heights that identified almost 600 students. So imagine, already there you've got, in just 2 school districts, you've got 800 students. There's only a little over 100 spots in a bed for shelters for families who are homeless. And as Annie mentioned earlier, only 30% of homelessness is kind of the old woman pushing a shopping cart on the street that has mental illness, or someone tweaking on drugs on the street corner. Most homelessness is 70% is what I call hidden homelessness. There's this population I worked with, families who are living in their cars, or in hotels that are pretty expensive if you're living on a regular basis, a lot more than just paying normal rent. Or they're often doubled up with families, so you can see families where there's 12 people in a 3-bedroom house. And so that was kind of the type of population I worked with, and I want to share some stories to kind of help give you some, I guess, humanize the issue and give you some perspective on things that these families go through. One client I had, I'll call her Gracie. She immigrated from El Salvador in 2009, and she had to wait she immigrated legally through a green card, a permanent residency card, and she waited like 3 years in order for her daughter to be able to come over as well, and paid a lot of money, went into a lot of debt in order to pay all the legal fees so that she could be with her daughter. And she worked about 40 to 60 hours a week as a cleaning a car dealership, and her family rented out a couple rooms. It was her daughter, her 2 sisters, and her mom, 5 of them total. And after about 4 years of living there, the landlord wanted to push them out and basically force them to live in the garage, where they had no climate control, nowhere to cook, didn't have immediate access to running water or to a bathroom, and was charging them $1,400 a month to live in that little garage that had no amenities. And she would give her $1,000 because she was like, "We're living in this little garage. It's not worth that much. I'll give you $1,000," and the landlord would just kind of not say anything and take it. And so, but from the debt she had from bringing her daughter over, um, she had bad credit, and so when she would apply for an apartment, she would get shut down. Most apartment buildings that have management companies, they want you to have 2 to 3 times the rent in your income, and to have a pretty high credit score. And with a lot of the families I work with that have rough things that happen and go into debt, and then have messed up credit, they just have such a hard chance finding any housing as it is. So Gracie and her family actually decided to, and Gracie was pretty mistreated by her employer. She'd get checks and they would bounce because the employer didn't have enough money. She didn't allow her to have lunch breaks. So it mistreated her well, didn't respect her. And so she ended up actually deciding to move her family to New Jersey, or Connecticut, to be with family there. And just because that was kind of the best option, and she was tired of being mistreated by her employer. But I'd like for you all to imagine just what it would be like being in Gracie's shoes. I grew up in a pretty stable, well-to-do family, and didn't have to worry about my safety or, my parents had good jobs. But the context she's coming from is from a place where there's violence and threat from gangs. Little to no economic opportunities or future for herself or her kids, and makes the perilous journey to immigrate here, and then has the all the issues that I kind of just described. How would you be able to stay sane amidst the stress that she lived through? A second family I want to share with a story about, the Sanchez family, I'll call them. They came to us because they got a notice to vacate from their property. They lived in this apartment for 17 years, and unfortunately in Alhambra and cities outside of LA proper, there's no protections around for renters. Basically, landlords can give you a notice to vacate, and if you don't have a lease and you're a month-to-month renter, they don't need to give a reason or a cause, no matter how long you've lived there. And so they lived there for 17 years, and now they get this notice, and they're frantically trying to figure out what to do. And it's pretty common for tenants like these to get notices to vacate. In Pasadena, they're actually organizing to institute a law called rent control that would provide more protections for renters, because in the last 6 years, the rent has risen 51.7%. And hardworking, teachers and working professionals are no longer able to afford their housing there. I had a guy install my heater like last week. I live in East LA. He has rented out space for his business for 30 years, since 1979, or it's more than 30 years, I think. And out of nowhere, he just gets this notice: you have 30 days to leave, to vacate. So he's freaking out. Where's his business gonna go? So we see there's a high market rate that is happening because there's not enough supply to meet the demand, so landlords can hike up the prices as much as they want. And so going back to the Sanchez family, they had this backup plan of, well, we can move to our family in the San Fernando Valley if we need to, but we're trying as hard as they could to stay in the area because their oldest son, was doing well in school, and he was about to graduate in May. And they, even if moving to San Fernando Valley was the best option, they were trying as much as they could to not uproot their family from their support systems and their school. fortunately, I never had to move around a lot or at all really as a kid, but I couldn't imagine like being at a school where I have all these friends and having to move just because we're no longer able to live in our apartment. The third story I want to share with you is about Sarah and her two daughters. She was actually an employee of the Alhambra School District. She worked in a cafeteria at an elementary school. And for 4 years, her and her two daughters lived in basically an illegal garage that was part of a back house. They were actually subleasing from the tenant who rented out the back house from the landlord that lived in the front house. And for 4 years, they didn't really have any problems. And then during the 5th year, the guy they subleased from started treating them pretty poorly, not letting them have visitors over, saying they couldn't use the dining room table to cook, the stove to cook, or eat in the dining room area. Was asking them to pay more in rent and pay more for cable, which he'd never done in the past. And then eventually the tenant who they were subleasing from got a notice to vacate and was getting evicted from the landlord. So that meant they had to leave as well, and they ended up moving. And so that was the reason they came to us. They ended up moving into a hotel after that. But fortunately, through my work with her, I helped her create a resume, and she was able to get a second job that significantly increased her income. So she was making enough income to be able to afford, their own place. But even then, they were living in a hotel for months just because they weren't able to find another place to live. And they also had a low credit score that made it really hard for them to make it into housing. Yeah, I moved to East LA about 2 months ago, and fortunately I found a really cool landlord who basically didn't ask for any credit checks, didn't ask for even an application. He just kind of trusted me and my friend. But that is not the norm, and me having a bachelor's degree and working as a professional, I don't make enough money to make what management companies ask for, 2 to 3 times your income. So it's just really rough out there, housing-wise. And given this current crisis of housing, I guess I want to urge you all as a congregation to consider taking any action through opportunities that you have for the sake of affordable housing in our county. When the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, it says that Yahweh saw the suffering, and he heard their cries of the Israelites. And he was concerned about their suffering, and he came down to rescue them. And you may not be personally affected by the crisis, which if you are, it's an easy motivator. But if you're not, like Yahweh, I think as part of the covenant that he invited the Israelites into, covenant being his covenant people, he knew Shiphrah and Puah's names, but did not know Pharaoh's name. But he still heard their cries of the people, and he was willing to work on behalf of those who are on the underside of life. So my question is, do you hear their cries? Do you, like Yahweh, know those who are resisting the structures of Pharaoh and willing to work and act on their behalf? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. The work you do is pretty amazing and inspiring to me. And also tragic. The thing that was really astonishing to me when Alex started telling me the stories about the work happening in Alhambra was that most of the families he worked with had an income. In fact, some of them, the last story we heard was about a mother who went out and got a second job and was able to vastly increase her income, and yet still wasn't able to find housing because the housing simply wasn't there. So LA Voice, like I said, is a network of congregations that bring people to come together to take on the structures, and in this case, the structure is the lack of housing. How do we actually build those structures, structured housing to house folks? And so this for us began with work of 3 congregations in Hollywood that came together to advocate for the building of low-income housing in their community. And we're able to, development by development, able to win a guarantee of certain units that would go to serve the communities that already lived there, and were getting priced out of Hollywood as it got more gentrified in the last 2 decades. And as those congregations came together, they then came together with congregations that were doing similar work in East Los Angeles and South Los Angeles, and were able to start to advocate for even bigger structures. And many of you may know that in the last year or 2, the County of Los Angeles came together to put out some pretty big structural changes and pass Measure H and HHH, which are going to be nearly $1 billion in housing in funding to house the homeless over the next 10 years. But the challenge that we are facing as we try and get this housing built is actually us, is actually the fact that we don't know the neighborhoods that are going to be willing to take and build this housing. Many of us, like I said, I believe, voted to pass Measure H so that we could house the homeless somewhere else. But amazingly, we could not actually house 50,000 homeless people on Skid Row. There really isn't the room. And as I said, the vast majority of homeless folks in this county live in the community where they were last housed. Many of them are working in that community. Many of them have kids in that school system. So the reality is that we are going to have to house people in the neighborhoods in which they last lived and in those local communities. And the challenge that we are going to face is us and our local neighborhoods and our willingness to accept and welcome people into our neighborhood to be housed. I started this conversation talking all the way back about the Tower of Babel. And when I think about the Tower of Babel, I often think in comparison of the curse of Balak on the Hebrew people, when he is sent to try and curse the Hebrew people and finds the community of Abraham and sees them in a circle with all of their tents facing one another and all of the doors of the tents drawn open to welcome the neighbor. And instead of being able to curse the community, he says, "How beautiful are your tents, O Abraham." And that reminds to me the commandment we have to welcome each other, to treat thy neighbor as theirself, and to reflect on the structures and communities that we want to build in Los Angeles. So our challenge to congregations as we move forward in the next few months is, now that we have won these big structural changes and we have funding to house the homeless, where are we going to put this housing? And how are we welcoming them into communities? And what is the work we have to do to talk to our neighbors about housing the homeless? And who are the homeless? Because so many of them are working families. Much of the homeless housing that we need to build is actually for people who are making $60,000 to $120,000 a year. There is not the housing to serve those communities right now, which is astonishing to me, given that those would be upper income families in a lot of counties. So the challenge that we are giving to congregations in the coming months, and I want to invite to the 2 congregations here tonight, is to do what we call compassion Sabbaths. Shabbat services where we are talking about the homeless, talking about the services we need in our community, and talking about the possibility of building affordable housing in our communities and how we do that. And living into that commandment to use our power to interrupt structures and to build bigger structures that reflect God's call to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annie. Before we go on tomorrow, if we have a couple of minutes, I just want to, are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Not everybody at once, please. Okay. Yeah, Jeff.
Ultimately, people in the communities object to changes in their communities. You want to build a multifamily building, housing tenants in what otherwise was a single-family neighborhood. It's very difficult to overcome the resistance of people who have bought homes in those areas. More likely, it's when zone changes occur, they add requirements for affordable housing. Those mechanisms already exist. The challenge is obviously where are you going to find the land and who owns that land and what will you require of them and the community around it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And often when we think about affordable housing and housing for the homeless, we tend to think of big developments that are going to be multifamily or are going to be oriented for single adults. But interestingly, because I think we all know that we're facing this crisis, one of the things that the county and that LA Voice is trying to think about a lot is actually, A, how do you build housing that is maintaining the integrity of a community? So building construction that is not super fancy housing, but is trying to maintain the character. Maybe it's a missionary-style neighborhood, maybe it's a craftsman-style neighborhood, trying to build things that are on the scale, that fit the zoning laws, and that actually a lot of this is going to have to happen through really small-scale development. The city of Pasadena just spent a very long time trying to think about accessory dwelling units, people being willing to build units to house one family, to house one person in their backyard, to be able to take a garage and convert it into something that is safe for a family to live in. And that may seem really small scale to us, but because of the scale of the problem and because of the restrictions you're talking about, there actually are a lot of really creative ways that we can house individuals on a smaller scale, and if we bring it up to level enough, could potentially have a huge impact.
Are there other questions? Yeah, don't go far. Okay. Oh, yes. Ellen.
So I think that's a really great idea. I haven't heard anyone mention that. I do think working with school systems is a really important solution. The challenge that we have is there's this story out of Temple City that I should have shared that is sort of astonishing to me. There was a basically ratty hotel right on the edge of Temple City that was a huge center of prostitution, a huge center of people using drugs, a huge waste on the community. And surrounding it, partially because it was so dilapidated, was also a bunch of tent cities. And a housing developer came in and said, you know what, we want to take this really burden on the community, this crime-ridden structure, and turn it into supportive housing, which is going to help take these folks who are living on the street and put them into a structure that is keeping them safe, that has 24-hour security, that has cameras, that is going to help put these folks on the path to recovery, to be able to live a healthy and safe lifestyle, and is frankly going to help make the community, which is really plagued by this awful center of crime, and these tent cities on the street, is going to kill two birds with one stone by taking this center of crime out of the community and help put homeless folks into a structure that's going to make the community safer. And what did the community say? How dare you build a building that's going to bring homeless folks into our community? We don't want homeless folks brought into this community. It is going to be worse for our community. Ignoring the fact that obviously this is what we need to do to house folks, but B, that actually having people on the street is not the safe thing for our communities, right? we need to be able to build housing, not just because it's the right thing to serve those who need it, but because that's what we need to do to make our communities safer. But often the reality is that even in an extreme situation like that, we're finding that communities are threatened by the idea of housing for the homeless in their neighborhood. So I imagine there are places like what used to be a school that folks are then going to say, we don't want this housing for the homeless in our neighborhood. And that's the challenge we find with every location. But I still think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Great. So again, 70% of folks who are homeless in Los Angeles County actually just can't afford housing. So probably if you could give them subsidized housing, they would be able to then purchase food, pay their own water bill. It really is affordability that is the huge issue in just being able to make rent. I know for me, when I moved here from Davis, California, my rent went up 5 times because my soon-to-be husband is a grad student. Our credit kept us out of a million apartments. I had never had that issue before in my life. I have for me, I was really proud of my income. But that said, a big chunk of what we are going to have to focus on is what we call supportive housing. And supportive housing is housing that means exactly that, support systems on site. So that means job training. It means mental health 24 hours on site. It means property management 24 hours on site. It means addiction treatment, and it means 24-hour wraparound support systems, because we do find that folks who have been living on the street for more than 2 years do have so much trauma that they do need support systems to stay housed. And that is a big part of what Measure H funding is out there to do, is to be able to do that work that helps bring people from homelessness to being able to work and thrive.
Thank you very much. Oh, one last question. Yeah.
So I don't know that there's an either or there. I think a person can make the encampments that already exist more habitable and safe for the community and still propose to do housing. The other thing is that actually for the last 30 years, the federal government believes that what you needed to do is provide people services. And once you provide them services and recovery and drug addiction treatment, et cetera, you could help them get to a place where they were stable enough to be housed. And actually, study after study showed that that wasn't true. No amount of job training in the world, no amount of drug addiction treatment in the world, if you didn't have that person housed in a place where they were safe, didn't have to worry about being attacked by another person, didn't have to face their drug dealer who was pushing them every night, that actually there was no way to get that person into recovery unless it started with housing.
I want to thank Annie again for taking her time. You can actually, this evening we have 2 options. There are more sessions about this topic. Annie's going to be teaching again after Mariv. I'm going to actually ask those that are teaching in the next session, I'm going to invite you up one at a time to just do a little description of your teaching at 9 o'clock. So, Rabbi Beth, will you come up and talk about your session, Seeing the Book of Ruth Through a Literary Lens, Vision and Compassion? Do you mind saying just a couple words, just a sentence or 2?
So, seeing the Book of Ruth through the eyes of literary giant Cynthia Ozick, who I don't know if anyone's a fan of hers. If you're not, or you haven't heard of her, you might become a fan after you come learn with me. She's one of the most important Jewish writers of the last century, and she has The teaching is based, we're going to go through the entire book of Ruth, all 85 verses, you know, in the time allotted. And we're going to look at what the rabbis said. We're going to look at what Cynthia Ozick said. And if there's time, we'll have a discussion about it also. It's going to be fun.
Rabbi Ron Goldberg, do you mind saying a couple sentences about your session, Jews in America, at Home or Homeless?
Good evening, everybody. Chag Sameach. The idea that I had was, we are in America. Are we living here, or is this a sojourn? Are we part of America, or are we apart from America? We're going to explore that. And we'll be done in time for dessert.
That is a big one. That is very important. Rabbi Vogel, will you say a couple words about love and marriage in the Bible? They go together.
Thank you all. It was so hard writing out that scripture not to continue it. But tonight we are focusing on homelessness, but the idea was also to provide some sessions that were not as focused on that particular issue. So each hour you'll have other options as well. Mine's going to look at three, if you will, elements of love relationship within the Torah. So one is just love stories that we have of, like Isaac, Rebecca, arranged marriages, if you will. The other was going to be about captured women in war. What does that mean in terms of relationships? And the Levirate marriage, when a husband passed away and the obligation when they're childless to have a child through one of the relatives, ties into the story of Ruth. But the idea is, what is the Torah trying to tell us about relationships, and how is it trying to direct us towards goodness in those relationships?
Thank you, Rabbi Vogel. The last session after Mariv, in our first round of sessions, will be taught by Annie. It's called Exodus and God's Challenge to Organize for a More Just Society. Do you want to? Yeah.
Exodus and power. It actually has nothing to do with homelessness. So if you want to talk about homelessness, come talk to me right now after Mariv.
Great. So we're gonna daven Mariv now, right? Yeah. Okay. We're good. So yes. Do you want to do the second ones too? All right, you're going to keep all of this in your head, I know. We could have done this. I was going to say we're going to do it at dessert, but we can do it now if you want. So the second session, Gary Shapiro, you say a few words about your session, how we heal head, heart, and hand.
Chag Sameach. We are going to look at an amazing text from the Talmud that deals with the relationship between a person visiting someone who's sick and the sick person themselves. It's really about what's the best way to approach an ill person, how do you deal with them, who are you when you visit a sick person, and who is the sick person. There's some really revelatory ideas, I think, in there about what that means to help someone who's sick.
Thank you, Gary. Rabbi Camrus, you want to say a few words about your session? Okay, all right. I'll see you there.
No, I'm serious. I am. So, Chag Sameach, everybody. Shavua Tov. My class, Ruth, a call to holiness. The question is, what does the story of Ruth teach us about how we can act with righteousness in this world? How can we turn ordinary acts into extraordinary deeds so that we can resolve problems like homelessness tonight? And what are the keys to holiness and ultimately the path to chesed, loving kindness?
Thank you, Rabbi Camrus. And Rabbi Adam Schaefer will be joining us in a little bit, and he's teaching a session called It's My Jam, Jewish Anger Management. And his description is as follows: one of the hardest things for any of us to do as humans is to handle our anger when we're upset. Thankfully, Jewish tradition offers a lot of helpful advice in this sensitive area. Join us for a look at Jewish anger management wisdom from the Torah to today. So those are the sessions. If you have any questions, as soon as Mariv is over, I'll make the announcements of where each session is being held. And after the first session, we'll go to dessert, and then we'll have our second round of sessions as well. All right. So now we're going to daven Mariv. In your prayer books, in your Sidurim, that should be in front of you, it is on page 39A, I believe.
Please rise for the call to prayer. Barechu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. Please be seated. Baruch atah Adonai Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uvein laila, Adonai tzivot shemo, el chai v'kayam, tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai, ha'ma'ariv aravim. Page 40. Avat olam beit Yisrael hamcha v'torah mitzvot ve'avatecha tasir mimenu l'olamim. Baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levav ub'chol nafshecha ub'chol me'odecha v'hayu advarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'beitecha u'b'lechtecha b'derech u'b'shochcha u'b'kumecha u'kshartam le'ot decha v'hayu letotafot bein einecha u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha. We continue on page 42. V'ya'im shemot. Leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'yitem kedoshim lelohechem. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem Elohim. Ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem emet. 43a. Page 44. Umalchuto v'ratzon kiblu aleihem Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lecha'anu shira b'simcha rabah v'yamru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh Nora tehilot o seifele Nora tehilot o יוסף למלכותך ראו בניך בוקי הים לפני משה זה אלי ענו ויאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגדול מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. Page 45. השכיבנו שלום ועבדים לכנו חיים וברסלמים שגות שלמך ונאמת אותו ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרסלנו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים. We rise please on page 46. וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה ועל מה דברי חירותי וימליך מלכותי וחייכון ומכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל בגלו בזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתעלה ויתעלה ותעלה שמי לקודשה ברכו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן ועלמה ואמרו Amen. We turn to page 306 for the festival Amidah, page 306. We add on 309 the prayer it says on Saturday evening. The following prayers recited to mark the end of Shabbat. And we also inclusions for Shavuot. יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו yalla la 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 la, yalla la la la, yalla la 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 la, la 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 la, yalla la 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 la, yalla la la la, yalla la 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 la, yalla la 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 la. Page 54, you may be seated. יתגדל ויגנה שמי רבה, ועמדי בחילותיה, וימלך מחוצה בחייכון, ומחון ובחיל כל בית ישראל בגלה בזמן קריב, יאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ותרומם וינשא ויתהלל 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 שמי תקודשה, ברכו לילה מן כל פרציו שירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צלותון ובתון וכל בית ישראל גמר שמיה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה בן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרמיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. We turn to page 79. Savri, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol am v'romamanu mikol lashon v'kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu b'yava moadim l'simcha chagim uzmanim l'sason. Et Yom Chag HaShavuot Hazeh, Zeman Matan Toratenu, Mikra Kodesh Zecher, Litziad Mitzrayim, Kivanu V'charta, V'yotanu Kidashta Mikol Hamim, U'moadei Kodshecha, B'simcha V'sason Hinchaltanu, Baruch Atah Adonai, Mekadesh Yisrael, V'hazmanim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei miorei ha'esh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol ben or l'choshech ben Yisrael la'ami ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yemei hamaseh ben kedushat Shabbat l'kedushat Yom Tov hivdalta Bet Yom HaShavi Misheshet Yemei HaMaseh Kidashta Hivdalta V'Kidashta Et Amcha Yisrael B'Kedushatecha Baruch Atah Adonai Hamavdil Ben Kodesh LeKodesh Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shechayanu v'kimanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol lateit gedula liotzer b'reishit shelo asanu kigoyei haratzot v'lo samanu k'mishbechot ha'adama shelo sam chelkeinu kahem v'gor aleinu k'chol hamonam anachnu korim Melech, Machei HaMachim, HaKadosh
You may be seated. If you have a need or desire to say the Mourner's Kaddish, please stay standing as we say the Mourner's Kaddish all together on page 58. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrach irutei ve'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach leolam u'lamei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitbarichu. Amen. Yehei shlama Rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Hu yaseh shalom. Amen. The breakout sessions is what we're going to go to. If you're going to go, I'm going to have you guys rise as I announce you. Rabbi Beth Lieberman, you're in Titus. So if you're new here, every room, you're either going to stay here. There are 2 rooms behind us called Titus and Lubin, and then the chapel is over there, okay? So for Rabbi Beth Lieberman, you're going to Titus, which is the last room in this main building. If you are sorry, my apologies. Sorry, she's going to Lubin, which is the last room, okay? It says Titus on here, but we had to switch it. So anyway, she's going to Lubin. Epstein, I'm not telling you where you're going. And Rabbi Ron Goldberg, you're going to stand up. You are going to be in the room right here, right behind this wall, which is Titus. Next to the dessert, that is correct. If you're next to the dessert. If you're going to go to Rabbi Vogel's, if you're going to go to the one entitled Love and Marriage, you're going to stay here in the sanctuary. And if you're going to go with Annie Fox, The Exodus and God's Challenge to Organize for a More Just Society, you are going to be in the chapel. So, Rabbi Lieberman, you're going to be the last door. Ron, you're going to be next door. Rabbi Vogel in here, and Annie Fox right across the way.
All right, if you're going to a different session, please get out of here. If you're staying, tell you what, come up to the front if you can. If you're staying, come on close by. Stacy, come on, move up closer. There you go. There you go. Perfect. Come on. If you're staying, come on in. If you're leaving, get out of here. Come on, Joan. You in, you out? Come on, which way you going? Laura, you in, you out? Meryl Alpert, are you in, you out? Where you going? Celebrated her bat mitzvah today. Her bat mitzvah was today. Flying high. Flying high. I'd like you all to have a chumash. We're going to get started. We're going to start early. Come on. Come on. Shh, if you will. You need to have a chumash, all right? To find a Torah, either in front of you or behind you, because otherwise you're going to be lost. I'm going to try.